So in today's video, I'm going to share why new nonprofits should not aggressively go after grants. I'm going to explain it, y'all, I promise. Let's get into it. Hey, this is Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help new and small nonprofits get up and running. So if you need help, you need to be subscribed to this channel because I drop videos every week. And I know you're already curious about this topic because I'm basically saying don't go after grants, but I'm going to explain this a little bit more, okay? So I'm particularly talking to new nonprofits, all right? I want to make that distinction. And this is nonprofits who are starting within their first 3 to 5 years, or even nonprofits who've been around for a while who don't have very large budgets, right? So I want to talk to you about why you shouldn't so aggressively go after grants. And I'm not saying you shouldn't go after grants. I'm saying that they shouldn't be your only source of income that you're looking towards, or you shouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about grants in the very beginning. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why you should not be doing that, all right? But I also want you to wait to the end of the video because I'm going to share tips for writing grants. I'm going to share tips to help get you where you need to be, where you can aggressively go after grants. So I'm going to share those tips at the end of the video, so make sure you watch to the very end. So the first reason I'm saying don't aggressively go after grants is because most people who are looking for grants as new nonprofits are looking for those big grants. Most people are looking for those $100,000, $250,000, because in their mind, they're thinking, I just need that one grant, right? So it's going to cost this much for me to run my program, and I'm just looking for a grant that will cover it all, and I'll be good. And a lot of people have that mentality because they just don't understand the process of starting a nonprofit. Why would they? Most people who are starting a nonprofit have never done that before, but I'm here to kind of dispel some of those myths. So the reality is, if you're looking for a substantial grant, and I'm talking like 50, 100, 100,000, then it's very unlikely that you'll get that grant as a new nonprofit. And it's because you don't have either a previous relationship with a funder, or you don't have a lot of evidence of impact, right? So you have to remember that when grant funders grant money, they are investing in something. They're not just randomly giving money away. There's intent behind the money that they give. And usually they've thought about who they want to give to, what topics or what causes they want to give to, right? So if they're giving you a significant amount of money, that means they're going deep on a topic, or they're going deep on an idea, and they're investing in you to see what the impact will be. So they're trying to make wise decisions. So they're vetting you. They want to make sure that they're comfortable giving this amount of money to an organization that's actually going to do what they say they're going to do, or based on their previous experience or trust or knowledge of the work they've done, they're pretty confident that they're going to do what they're supposed to do. Relationships matter when it comes to grant funders. It matters a lot. And if you don't have that relationship, or you don't have that evidence of impact, then it's going to be really hard to get a funder to believe in you enough to give. Now, there are rare circumstances. I'm not going to sit here and say it never happens, but it's very rare, right? It's very rare where a funder doesn't know much about you, but your idea is so amazing, so different, so innovative, that they'll fund you without that prior knowledge. But again, it's usually something that sparks their interest, or something like 1 in a million, like this great idea that a lot of people aren't doing. It's something that's rare. So I just want you to keep in mind that if your mindset is, I just need that one grant and I'll be good, it is usually not the case that you're going to be funded a substantial amount of money in the beginning. Not saying it's impossible, but in the beginning. And I know some people are going to come on here and say, Tiffany, that's not true. I know this person who got this grant funding, all they had to do this, blah, blah. And I'm telling you that more than likely, they had a relationship with somebody, or they knew someone, or they had a prior working relationship or something that made that possible. All right. Number 2, you don't have the administrative structure to manage the grant. That's more than likely the case if you are a new nonprofit. So people forget that, the process for winning grants is not just the writing process. It's actually the award. It's actually receiving the award. It's actually managing the grant. And especially with certain types of grants, particularly government grants, it can take a lot of administrative time to manage and run and make sure you're doing the right accounting and reporting of the funds that you get through those grants. A lot of grants, you need a whole position to just manage that, to do data tracking. You may have to, in your accounting, make sure the funding is only going towards certain activities. And that requires administrative time and know-how to do that. And when you're a new nonprofit, who's doing all the work? Who's usually the person who's doing everything? It's usually the founder or a group of volunteers, and you usually don't have the money up front to fund a position to handle something like that. So it all falls on your shoulders. And do you have the time to learn that stuff and also the time to manage it while you're also trying to run the whole organization? So I want you to think about, like, do you have the capacity to be able to manage a grant? The other thing is, when it comes to certain types of grants, especially government funding, there are requirements that you can't get out of. So for some federal government funding, you have to have a yearly audit. And a yearly audit may cost thousands of dollars. And do you have the money for that? Do you have the money and the time to be able to pull your records together to be ready for an audit? Because it's not just somebody coming in. You got to be ready for that. You got to prepare your financials and things like that for that. And then you got to take the recommendations, and you may have to make changes to some of your processes as a result. And you have to ask yourself, are we ready for that? When you're super new in your first 3 to 5 years, you may not have the capacity to do those types of things. So I want you to think about all of that, the reporting, the accounting, the auditing requirements, all that extra stuff we don't think about because we get so excited that we can get grant funding. So just think about, like, the next step after and whether or not you're ready for that. And maybe you need to wait until you have funds together to do that. Here's another thing I want you to think about before I talk about the third and last thing. Some grants are built on like a reimbursement model. So that means that you are not going to get funding until you do the activity first, and then you submit a report to get reimbursed for that activity. So this happens with government grants. So you have to put up some effort. You got to pay people first and then get reimbursed for the work. So that gap period requires funding. And if you're only relying on grant funding or relying on that one grant, then how are you going to pay your staff in the meantime? So this also applies for other types of grants, not just government grants, when it comes to the time it takes for them to award you the money. Sometimes based on their administrative structures, foundations or grant making agencies take a long time to cut you the check. They take a long time to give you the money that they promised. And a lot of times they'll rush you to give them information, but they'll take their time to pay you. So in the meantime, your programs may be up and running and you still haven't seen that money. That happens a lot, and people don't necessarily realize that. So you got to have funds in the bank to be able to deal with that gap while you're waiting for the money to come in. And when you're super new, you may not have all those operating funds yet. So that's why I'm saying wait a little while to go so aggressively after grants until you have some money in the bank to account for things like that. And the third reason why you shouldn't go aggressively after grants is because grants don't cover all types of costs. So most grants have stipulations with how you're supposed to spend the money, and every grant is different, right? So some grants will say you can't use this money for salaries. Some grants will say you can only use this money for salaries. Some will say you can only use this for materials. Some will say you can't use this money on materials, right? And in a lot of circumstances, if it's a program grant particularly, then you can't use it for admin costs, or you can only use a small percentage of the money for admin costs. Meaning if you need to pay an accountant, or if you need HR services, or your overall rent for all your buildings or maintenance for things, if you can't attribute it to a program, that's an admin cost, and those grant funds will not cover it if they're not allowed in your grant agreement. So again, people don't realize that. So they think, oh yeah, we may have this grant, but we can't even spend the money the way we need to. We really need to do this, right? We need to really invest in our infrastructure so we're prepared for the next couple of years when we're trying to scale our programs. But this grant will only let us do this within this parameter, within this time. So that's why I'm saying don't aggressively go after grants and that be the only thing you're going after, because you still need funding to cover other types of costs. You need more unrestricted types of funding to be able to go after that. Now, here's the thing, right? Some grants are unrestricted. There are general operating grants, which will give you money that you can use that you have a little bit more freedom to use it as you need to. But those grants are not as common as program grants. So most grants will have stipulations on them. So that's another thing you just need to keep in mind. If you're only going after grants, then it leaves a gap in funding where you're not able to cover or pay for admin costs. So I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer. I know some people still want to go after grants. They still think it's a viable source. And sure, you should. I don't believe that you should not go after grants. I'm just saying it shouldn't be the only thing. So I want to give you like 3 tips, like 3 pieces of advice if you're still going after grants, especially as a new organization. So the first piece of advice is keep writing. You're going to hear no a lot. And I don't want you to get discouraged. What I want you to do is use the feedback that you do get to keep refining your proposal. Grant writing, when you're doing it yourself, especially when you're not hiring it out, when you're doing it yourself, it's a great exercise because it requires you to figure out how to persuade somebody to give to you. It requires you to be organized about that argument, right? It requires you to write down your need statement. It requires you to have some kind of budget in place to submit to the grant for the grant application. It requires you to talk about impact and think about how you're collecting information on outcomes that you otherwise may not be doing if you to that level, if you're looking at other types of fundraising, right? So I like the exercise of grant writing because it helps people get prepared. It helps people get organized in a way that they may not do if they're doing other types of fundraising. If you need help writing out what a grant proposal looks like, especially if you don't have any kind of guide, make sure you grab my grant writing workbook. It actually walks you through several worksheets where at the end, once you answer the questions, you'll have the meat of a proposal that you can piece together and submit for grant applications. The second piece of advice I have for new nonprofits is to partner up. So when you're trying to get grants, it's really important to collaborate with more established nonprofits or to partner with nonprofits who do things well that you don't do well. So they kind of make up what you lack. You guys are a good fit in that way. You can partner up together and go after grants, right? Or if you're partnering with a more established organization that's more likely to get funding because they may have relationships or they may have years of evidence of their impact, then the likelihood of winning increases because you're going in as a subcontractor with them or as a partner with them. So one way to actually win more grants is to partner up with other nonprofits and leverage their relationships and leverage their history and their credibility to help you win funding. And the third piece of advice, which I would give for anyone who's trying to raise money, whether it's grants, whether it's asking for donations or whatever, make connections wherever you go. It really is about relationships. So find out who the funders are in your community, find out who works for them, start meeting with them, start talking about the work that you're doing, start asking them what they're focusing on, what their goals are, ask for their advice to see where you should focus, who you should be talking to, all that kind of stuff, so that you're building connections so that once you start getting your feet wet and you start getting more established, people will begin to recommend you. People will begin to vouch for you in places that you're not even in, right? So you want to build those solid relationships because eventually they will bear fruit and eventually they will work in your favor. So start as early as possible, getting to know people, getting your name out there so those relationships can then benefit you later on down the line. So I hope this information was helpful. I know you're going to go back and tell somebody, Tiffany said we're not supposed to go after grants. If you're saying that, then you completely missed the point of the video, but that's fine. So if you need more help with your nonprofit, make sure you visit me at www.bossonabudget.com and I'll see you in the next video.